in the days to come after the event. We have a little bit of time for a brief question and answer session, but we also invite you to ask questions on the chat function, and World Benchmarking Alliance colleagues will either respond directly or pick these questions up following the launch in a written Q&A response. So in terms of today's agenda, we'll hear first from the World Benchmarking Alliance's Vicky Sims, who leads the decarbonisation and energy system transformation strand for the Alliance. And she will present the ranking and key findings for the electric utilities benchmark. We will then hear from leading companies in the benchmark, including the top ranked company Ørsted and CLP, who were the leaders from the East Asia region, to celebrate best practices and share the opportunities for improvement. The benchmark highlights the role of influence in both enabling and hampering the sector's ability to shift to a low carbon transition. So after Vicky, we'll hear from David Marchal from ADEME, the French Agency for Ecological Transition, and Eurelectric's Bruce Douglas on regional trends and the influence of policy and advocacy. Advocacy. Our final dialogue will explore the broader decarbonisation and energy transformation process with Will Dawson from Forum for the Future, Emily Hickson from B-Team, and Emily Krebs from CDP, speaking to the role of multi-stakeholder collaboration, corporate and investor action in enabling a fast, low-carbon transition. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Vicky Sims to reveal the results.
Thank you, Mike. Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today, and a warm welcome to everyone from all types of organizations and from all around the world. The World Benchmarking Alliance, we're building a movement to measure and incentivize business impact towards a sustainable future that works for everyone. In partnership with our nearly 150 allies, government supporters and sustainability experts and inclusive multi-stakeholder audiences, we build methodologies, benchmarks, which measures and rank the performance of impact of companies on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the Paris Agreement and other things. We take a system transformation approach with the belief that everyone in the system has a specific role to play. We therefore hold everyone in the system accountable in transforming and the ability to address the social, economic and environmental challenges that are stopping us from reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. As we all know, without further urgent climate action, the world will experience more extreme weather events. It will see sea level rise, and it will have negative impact on the biodiversity, the ecosystems, and on our oceans. These will have a disproportionate effect especially on the poorest and most vulnerable populations for decades to come. That's why today we are launching our electric utilities benchmark, and which is the second in the series of rankings within the climate and energy benchmarks, which in total will rank 450 keystone companies in various high-emitting sectors. These benchmarks will be updated on a reiterative basis. The benchmarking highlights industries and companies that are leading the way, as well as forming an evidence basis for laggards to be held accountable, and will have to drive action amongst the various stakeholders that are active in the system change. Private sector engagement, alongside actions by governments, civil societies, are critical for meeting the Paris goals and the Agenda 2030. The climate benchmarks, as mentioned by Mike, are built in partnership with CDP and ADEME and the ACT initiative. The benchmark operationalizes the Assessing Low Carbon Transition, in short ACT methodology, and it has a specific sector focus on the electric utility sector, and it assesses an organization's readiness to transition to a low carbon economy. And it is in the end the aim to drive these companies to move to a well below 2-degree pathway in terms of their climate strategy, their business model, the investments they need to make, their daily operations, as well as the GHG emissions management. This current benchmark assesses and ranks the performance of 50 global electric utility companies on their performance and reducing their emissions in order for them to contribute to a low carbon economy. These companies were selected for the influence and the accountability they have and they hold in leading the sector towards a low carbon model. I will now be sharing my screen so I can show you the key findings that we have for the sector. The electric utility benchmark overall shows that the most influential electric utility companies are actually powering down on decarbonization. The assessment uses the IEA's beyond 2-degree scenario decarbonization pathway. This pathway has a target for the whole sector to converge to a net negative emission by 2050. The results of the analysis show that there's still a heavy reliance on fossil fuel and the infrastructure across the full sample of the 50 companies. This means that the companies, the society, as well as the economy is set for a high carbon future if this path is to be continued. So when assessing the performance of these 50 companies, we see that due to this strong fossil fuel dependency, there's actually a dim prospect for decarbonization. We see that only 35 of the 50 companies, or we see 35 of the 50 companies that we have assessed are already set to exceed their full carbon budget. We also see that the climate performance of 66% of the selected companies is expected to decline in the near term. This means that their trend score, so if we would reassess them in the short term or in the near term, that actually we expect the performance that they show today to actually worsen. So this is not the trend that we like to see. So what does this say? Oh, it doesn't. What does this say about the 50 companies and their ambition to achieve the Paris Agreement? Well, we only see that 4 companies have set fully Paris-aligned emission reduction targets, and many of the targets of the 46 remaining companies are considered to be inadequate or not ambitious enough. In order for these companies to achieve the Paris Agreement, we actually need to see bold action. We need to see these actions because otherwise we expect these companies to fall further behind on their decarbonization pathways, especially as we expect the scenario or the decarbonization pathway that they need to fulfill to be and measured against will be increased in ambition from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. We encourage the companies and the sector to demonstrate their commitment by setting credible and ambitious targets through the Science Based Targets initiative. The third finding that I would like to highlight is that the benchmark shows that low carbon transition planning is currently not sufficient to spark the change that we need to see. 42 of the 50 companies have a low carbon transition plan or have made transition planning commitments. But if we look closer to the performance and the examination of the results actually show that there's insufficient action. Companies are not implementing sufficiently resilient long-term strategies to enable the successful low-carbon transition and to deliver on the low-carbon transition plans that they themselves have set. So to demonstrate the commitment to reduce their absolute emissions, we need companies to develop high-quality transition plans, and we need these plans to include the current and projected generation mix, and these plans need to include a phase-out date for coal use. The fourth finding is also to say that we need more to power the growth of renewables. So looking forward, we need to see a greater attention to this growth of renewables. We need to see that companies and the industry as a whole needs to increase the capacity of renewables in their generation mix. Despite the fast growing and improving economics of renewables, the technological advances and favorable policy landscape in certain markets, we only see some companies switching fossil fuels for renewables. The biggest emitters would need to decarbonize swiftly and deeply. There is a big difference across regions and companies, but we expect all players in the industry to increase their share of renewables. So we also see that this is not the only thing that the industry can do to decarbonize. The low carbon transition is shaking up the traditional electric utility business model and is creating new opportunities. Increasingly stringent climate policy, falling technology costs, and changing consumer demands and emerging market disruptors can energize the sector. So research and development into new technologies to mitigate climate change is pivotal for the decarbonization of the whole sector. This needs to be backed up by financial commitments from the company and the industry. The findings show that more transparency is needed on the financial commitments of these companies in these technologies. So then going to the ranking, we see that Denmark Ørsted leads the sector, and we see that they are leading because of their rapid energy transformation to a low carbon business model, their rigorous target setting, and their focus on renewables. It has actually set more ambitious targets than the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and is also fully on track in meeting those targets. Overall, as you can see, the top 5 companies, Ørsted, ENGIE, EDP, Portugal, Iberdrola, and Électricité de France, EDF, are actually all from Europe. This shows true leadership from the region around target setting, their transition planning, their performance against the transition planning, as well as top management buy-in and policy engagement on climate policies. But we also see that within Europe, there are some laggards, mainly around Germany, which could undermine the leadership position for Europe as a whole, if this is not improved soon. The climate policy ambition in the region is high. Hence, we also expect that these companies that are not performing well enough to significantly need to step up their game. If we then go to the East Asian region, we see that CLP Holdings, based in Hong Kong, is leading the East Asian region. It does so because it has shown strong leadership on policy through engagement with national policymakers to support the energy transition that is needed. It has also committed to not build any further coal-fired plants, and they are the only one in the region that have made such a commitment so far. As you can imagine, the average installed capacity in this region is significantly higher than the other regions. The emission intensity in this region is also significantly higher. However, if we look at the average performance of this region, is considered poor. Supporting the transition and reducing the absolute emissions will have a significant impact on the whole industry. We need this region's contribution to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement. If we look into the US, we see that this region shows a large variety of performance, with Excel leading the region. We do, however, see very little true climate leadership. We see that there's a strong corporate influence and negative climate lobbying. We acknowledge that it is a complex system and that there is a large mix of significant competitive markets. However, it has a great potential to support the transition, but we need other stakeholders to engage strongly with this sector to take up this leadership role. Thank you, Mike. This was it.
Sorry, just finding my mute button. Thank you, Vicky. So within the benchmark then, what do you think is the most important finding for you that emerges from the ranking and the benchmark?
Yeah, I think if we look at the full benchmark, we see the electric utility sector as a great enabler, because the decarbonization of this sector is actually also enabling the deliverable of the decarbonization in other sectors. So we need this sector to step up. And it is the great enabler of a low carbon transition. However, if you see that only 10% of the 50 companies have actually Paris-aligned targets, then it's not enough. We don't see enough happening. We also see that if you look at what the maximum score is, it's 28 plus is the maximum score that you can achieve. And actually the median score of the full sample was 7.1 D minus. So considering this average score, which is significantly low, that was the most striking result, because we would have expected this sector to be a bit further than what the research show. We also see that only Ørsted is the only company that gets an A for the narrative score, and only one of the 5 companies that has a positive outlook if we would do this reassessment again in the near future. So we need disruption in this sector. We need this through innovation. We need this through technology, but also through investments. And we hope and expect that this benchmark and these results will help us to inform the companies, but also other stakeholders, to hold the industry accountable and incentivize them to truly step up, to instigate and lead a clean energy transformation, because other sectors and industry depends on the deliverable of a low carbon economy from the electric utility sector.
As you point out, the electricity sector is an enabler for everyone else, and it's you would assume ahead of all other sectors when it comes to decarbonisation. There is this view that there's great progress being made on renewable energy in terms of costs and deployment and things like that. Did it come as a surprise to you, the lack of progress that there's been?
Yes, it did come as a surprise, because we say, okay, if we look at the science that shows us what is really needed to deliver on the Paris Agreement, and then we see that 46 out of the 50 companies that in the sample do not have emission reduction targets that are aligned with the well below 2 degrees scenario. And even out of those 46, half of them have not set any emission reduction targets, or have no targets that go beyond 2022. So that was the biggest surprise, that we say, okay, if you look at what is needed in the low carbon transition, then the sector isn't taking the target setting seriously enough at the moment. And that's what the clear call to action is from this benchmark, is to say the companies that have not set the targets, you need to set targets not only for the long term to decarbonize, but also we need to see intermittent targets to ensure that there is the correct trajectory of the performance against those targets. And we publish these benchmark on an iterative basis, as I said, meaning that we will be able to track the progress, or maybe the lack of the progress, and then of the performance against the targets that these companies have set. And we see that the climate ambition, we currently use the 2 degree pathway, but we expect this to increase to a 1.5 degree pathway. This means that, the gap of what's currently being delivered and the gap that is expected to come, the gap is expected to widen. And that's why the clear call to action now is you need to ramp up your climate ambitions and incorporate these scenario plannings. And that's why I mentioned the science-based targets already. Currently, 9 of the 50 have set science-based targets. but only 5 of them are actually committing to targeting the well below 2-degree scenario. So we need to significantly see an uptake on those target setting, and then the next one is the delivery on those targets.
And in terms of achieving those goals, how does the benchmark help with that? In terms of, is it just to do with bringing greater transparency and scrutiny to the level of ambition that companies have? Is it about letting people, helping people to sort of hold the companies to account for the ambitions, that both they've stated and that that are missing? That is that the key benefit of the benchmark?
The benefit is that these results can be used indeed as an engagement tool through other stakeholders to have the dialogue with the companies to drive the next call to action. But as I mentioned, we do need to see more target setting, and then what the benchmark does is not only to accept, and that's what the benchmark shows, that companies have set targets, but also to truly investigate and research the performance of these companies. So are the investments that these companies make, or the divestments that they make, the R&D spend, is that in line with what we believe and need to see happening in order for these companies to meet their own targets that they've set? And currently we see that there's only a very small percentage of the full sample that actually is living up to their own target setting. So that's what the benchmark does. It reveals that there is more action needed. The industry has all the technology and ability to deliver on this, but we need to see greater ambition from different regions and from individual companies, but also the industry as a whole, to live up to that great enabler that we believe that this sector is and can be and should be.
Great. We had a question from Rick Walters. He says, it seems that a lot of the findings are based on what the companies have reported. How do you know that just because a company doesn't report on something, that they're not doing it?
Yeah, no, sorry, it's indeed, it's what the company is reporting. And one of the key drivers that we would like to say is we want to drive transparency. So we want companies to report on the targets that they've set, but also on how they are going to achieve those targets. And we want the companies to transparently report on their investments, on their strategic decisions, but also on how has the management bought into the target setting and in the end the strategic decisions associated with delivering on those targets. There is a strong engagement process with the companies for them to verify the data that is used in the assessment periods. So companies have the ability to supplement the data as well as verify the data alongside the assessment periods. And we ask the companies to get involved in delivering the data. But you can see that there's some regions are not all data is available. So that's where, of course, we try to engage with the companies as much as possible to gather the data. But in the end, the data needs to be put in the public domain for everyone to be accessible and also verifiable in order for it to be reliable in the end, to be used in this assessment.
Sure. We've got a couple of questions on regulatory issues. One from Sandy Nessing, and then a sort of supplementary from Miriam Afma. So Sandy says, do you consider regulatory regimes that can be really restrictive? So you have companies that want to move fast but often can't because of the regulatory regimes, and therefore there's an assumption that they're not taking the issue as seriously as they actually are. And then Miriam adds, in addition to that, do you consider other systemic factors as well as regulatory criteria? For example, security of supply, the social impact on the labour market, or public acceptance of technological change?
Yeah, on the policy element is an important part of the methodology, where we look at, and we hope that later on we will hear from two players, Eurelectric as well as the French government, to elaborate on what policy environments can do to stimulate change. We definitely need policymakers to create the right regulatory environment for companies to be able to deliver on the Paris Agreement. We see that in countries like, for example, Japan, we see that the performance there of these companies is aligned with the national determined contributions of the country. However, there we also see that we need these plans to be more ambitious, and that's where, of course, policymakers can play a role to set more ambitious targets for the sector, especially the sectors that have the technology available to deliver on this, because there will be other sectors in specific countries that will not be able to transform as quickly. But if the countries that participate, that have signed up on the Paris Agreement, are serious about delivering on this commitment, we would need to see them to create the policy environment that is needed for these companies to step up. However, there's also a clear call to action to the private sector themselves to sometimes move faster than policymakers, because we also see that companies can move faster, and we see that then there will be the inevitable policy response later on to support the full sector's ability to deliver on the goals. When we see that other stakeholders are needed, or other factors that play a role, obviously, when you see the difference in regional findings, where of course there is it's obvious that some regions might move slower than other regions, and yes, there will probably be also other factors at play there. We do have and that's why we see this benchmark and the results thereof an important engagement tool in the coming year to come as well, is that we need to engage with all the stakeholders that are important players in delivering on this ambition, to engage, and that includes policymakers, to see this transition needs to happen in the next decades. And that means that you need to set intermittent targets for the next 5, for the next 10 years, but also for the next 20 years, in order for you to make sure that the transformation includes all the factors that are affected by the transformation, and whether that's being technological changes, whether that means social transformation, that all needs to be taken into account. And that can happen if you have the right transition path and the right targets planning for the next period to come, to take all these factors into account.
Great, thank you very much for all of that, and for clarifying a great deal of what you said earlier. I will bring in Rasmus Skov now, the head of sustainability at Ørsted, and he'll be followed by Hendrik Rosenthal from CLP Group. He's the director of group sustainability there. So starting with Rasmus, congratulations, first of all. Your company's ranked first in the benchmark. How do you react to that? And what does it say about the journey that your company's been on over the last few years, which is a well-publicized shift from being the Danish oil and natural gas company, also very active in coal as well, to a company that is now overwhelmingly focused on renewables. So the benchmark clearly reflects that. You must be pleased that your efforts are sort of recognised in this way.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. We're very proud to be ranked number one. I I'll get back to why we've come to that position. I think a little later on, but first of all, I want to say that I think it's very important to create this kind of clarity on the ambitions of the sector. Frankly, I was a little disheartened by reading the report because I was expecting a little more ambition, and I think this transparency and clarity on where the sector is, despite all the progress that we continue to hear about, is frankly a little disheartening. Because obviously the benchmark takes a starting point in the Paris Agreement, and I'd really wholeheartedly support what Vicky also said, that we need to aim for the 1.5 degree scenario. It's obviously it's very obvious to us that there is a big difference between 1.5 degrees and 2. 2 is a lot more is a path that is a lot more risky to go down, and we need to aim for 1.5, and that gives us a decade of action to really transform the way that we produce and consume energy. When you look at how almost 75% of global carbon emissions come from the consumption of fossil energy, and almost 1/3 comes from power production, the sector really needs to step up. A decade ago, as you said, Ørsted was part of the problem. We were one of the most fossil-intensive energy companies in Europe. We had a large legacy oil and gas business that has since been divested. Today, we're one of the world's largest renewable energy developers with a strong focus on offshore wind. A few years ago, we launched a vision of a world that runs entirely on green energy, and we're determined to do our part to get there. We have a target of 99% green energy in our energy generation by 2025, and we've come a long way already. We're at 86% today. In parallel, we're targeting carbon neutrality in our energy generation and operations also by 2025. That includes a reduction target of 98%, and obviously we're determined to see if we can find even further reductions. We have a lot of different processes at the moment that look into that, and we will inevitably have to rely on some kind of offset where we want to find something that actually removes carbon from the atmosphere. Today we're at 86% reduction since 2006. The main drivers in that have been the phasing out of coal, so the conversion of our coal-fired power stations, and the last one will be shut by 2023, and also, of course, the build out of green energy. We've also set a target to be carbon neutral in our entire value chain by 2040. We'll get there by gradually reducing the natural gas that we sell, but it will leave us with one remaining challenge, which is our supply chain. And in January, we launched a new supply chain decarbonization program that goes directly after the main emitters in our supply chain, or through a collaborative process. We're very encouraged by the response that we've received from our suppliers, and also from various other parties that would really like to collaborate with us on this journey. So one thing is that we decarbonize our own energy generation and operations, but we really want to take responsibility for our supply chain as well. When you look at the financial metrics of this transformation, we're going to be investing more than $30 billion between now and 2025 in green energy. And it actually creates a lot of value for us. We became a listed company in 2016, and since then our value has more than tripled. So it's been a very, very sound business case for us, and I think the business case is an obvious imperative here. And what makes me really hopeful that this global green energy transformation can actually happen is that the price of green energy is cheaper in 2/3 of the world's markets than it is for fossil energy. For offshore wind alone, the price has dropped by more than 60% in the past handful of years. So I think there is plenty of opportunity for the sector to decarbonize and to do it while creating value, while being financially sustainable. And frankly, I'd really like to see a lot more of that. And I think the benchmark shows that there is still ample potential for transformation.
Great, thank you very much for that. So you mentioned this, the importance of this financial case, and you're, as a company, very much an example of a company that has transformed the way you operate, but crucially, you've continued to perform financially as well. You've sort of been ahead of the investment community in making this change, but how important are investors to helping the sector to align with the 1.5 degree targets, and what can investors do to help to drive this global green energy transformation?
I think when you look at, regardless of the price drops that we've seen, it is still a capital intensive process to radically and swiftly transform energy generation globally. So investors obviously have a very, very large role to play. We've actually just recently done a study together with a Danish financial institution called Nordea, the biggest bank in the Nordics. And what they showed was that, what the bank showed was that companies with a strong green narrative, as they put it, that includes renewable energy, of course, generally performed 21% better than the average market. And when they look into the future, also the enabling sectors, i.e. sectors that produce technologies, cables, etc., that enable the green energy transformation, they're also going to benefit from this. So I think there is a strong business case for investors as well. And I think that's one thing. It is also about having the will and the urgency to play a role here as an investor. And therefore, we say very clearly, we think, and we've been in discussions with many investors about this, that are fully on board with this narrative. Investors need to commit to net zero targets for their portfolios. They need to report on progress, and they need to drive change in the companies that they own parts of, because we need that stimulus to come from every angle, and we've experienced firsthand the power of an investor question, and I think investors have a big role to play, and I think it's also, I think we see that very clearly in the investment community now, that there is a lot of interest in not just the financial business case, but also the planetary business case.
Thank you. And there's a question now from Emmy Mizuno. You've talked about that sort of top-down pressure from investors, but also the need to decarbonize your supply chain. What do you think the biggest barrier is to doing that? Particularly, I guess, in your case, for a company that uses a lot of steel, which is a very carbon-intensive industry.
So the pressures, I think in terms of pressures, for us, it's about, this is an internal dynamic first and foremost, but we've said we want to be even more ambitious than what science requires of companies to do. We want to not set a 2050 value chain neutrality target. We want to set a 2040 value chain target. So we want to take responsibility for what takes place outside of our own walls. We're experiencing a lot of positive feedback from our suppliers that really see the value in this. They see the value in collaboration, and they see the value in transforming their business and providing greener jobs for their employees, and also greener companies for their investors to invest in. So I think I can't point to one single impetus that drives this. that drives this. I think it's a dynamic where we see a lot of different stakeholders taking a keen interest in decarbonizing and being part of that journey.
Great, thank you very much for that, Rasmus. I'd now like to bring in Hendrik Rosenthal, the Director of Group Sustainability at CLP, which is, as Vicky mentioned, the leading company in Asia in the benchmark. What's your response to the fact that you're the top performing company in Asia, but you're outside the top 10 overall companies? What do you think leads to that dichotomy?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me here. And of course, we're quite pleased to be included in this, if you like, leading group of companies. Even though we are only ranked 13, we are at the top for Asia Pacific. Maybe just to reflect a bit in terms of what we do at CLP and where we operate. We have our roots in Hong Kong, where we've been operating for almost 120 years, and have since, in particular over the last 20, 30 years, expanded to markets here in the region, in particular mainland China, India, and Australia, with a mixed portfolio of assets. Obviously, coal being sort of the starting point, as for many other utilities. And then over the years, we had invested in nuclear power, one of the first nuclear power plants in China that now feeds Hong Kong, and then have expanded to natural gas and renewables, in particular over the last 10, 15 years. So what that means for us, I guess, in terms of why are we where we are, is a combination of different factors that play out here in our markets, and that being constraints related to regulatory and sort of market constraints, as well as technology itself, in terms of how do we apply that here in the region. It's been particularly important for us to engage with regulators, to engage with the community, to be part of sort of the leading thinking in terms of decarbonization and the energy transition. So we have been quite active in a number of different working groups related or led by WBCSD, for example. We've done quite a bit of work on TCFD, the Energy Transition Commission, and then here locally as well, where we have had a long-standing relationship with one of the WBCSD subsidiaries, the Business Environment Council. And then that's, sort of what we do, and what we think is the right thing to do is to inform the community where we operate. But since 2007, we have also set ourselves a climate goal, what we call the Climate Vision 2050. We were one of the first companies here in the region to set ourselves targets for decarbonization, and then also set ourselves targets in terms of how do we increase, or by how much we should be increasing our renewable and non-carbon emitting portfolio. So that has now brought us to a point where we can say by 2050, we expect to have an 80% reduction of carbon intensity of the electricity that we send out to our customers. And on top, having the ambition to have 30% of our portfolio by 2030 to be renewable and 40% non-carbon. So that's the inclusion of nuclear in that. Looking at it, it does make us a leader here in the region, and you're quite right to point out, as Vicky has as well. We are the only company in the region that has made a commitment now to no longer invest in additional coal-fired capacity. And that has been in itself a key discussion within the organization, as we have made investments in the past in coal, but now at this point it is not something that fits with our strategy and how we want to transform as a business. The key challenge, I guess, for us to accelerate this transition, so the 80% reduction in itself, and this is very much reflected in the score we received as part of this initiative from the World Benchmarking Alliance, is that it is not a science-based target. 80% reduction is simply not good enough in order to be Paris aligned and well below 2 degrees. Now, as a company that has its roots in, I suppose, a culture that is not only set on doing the right thing, but also doing things we know how to do, meaning that setting targets that are realistic and knowing how to achieve those targets is of utmost importance. As much as we like to be ambitious, if we don't know how to get there at this point, it is something that as an organization, we just don't feel enough comfort in doing. And that is, reflected in the targets where we simply take the view that certain technologies that are currently not commercially viable and deployable, such as, for example, carbon capture and storage, will not be factored into our target setting process. We just simply cannot count on something that we just don't know at this point whether that A, will be the technology that will help us to decarbonize to the level that we need, or B, that's something that we can actually deploy here in our region, in our markets. So this is sort of the combination of ambition or being pragmatic, if you like, and being realistic at the same time. Pragmatism with a hint of idealism, given that we have set ourselves targets at 2050, which is perhaps from an Asia-Pacific perspective, something that many companies here are just not yet able or willing to do. And if you were to look at the constraints simply from a regulatory perspective that we have, for example, in Hong Kong, it is not our choice to do as we please by investing, divesting, or changing our portfolio mix. It's something that the government ultimately sets for us. We are implementing the government's ambition to decarbonize Hong Kong's fuel mix and Hong Kong's carbon footprint. And of course, we have dialogue with government to help along that process and to push it in the right direction. So we are in the process, and the result of that currently being a large investment in natural gas as a transition fuel, and a natural gas receiving terminal is being instrumental in making sure that we can source natural gas from markets here in Hong Kong that is also allowing us to be cost competitive as much that is possible. For that type of fuel. So we are implementing what is, to sort of speak, the wish of the government, so that we can balance at the end of the day, not just the environmental impact. Obviously, there's that ambition to reduce the carbon intensity, moving away from coal to gas as being a viable alternative, but also then at the same time making sure that we maintain reliability, maintain safety, and then bringing electricity to our customers at rates that are similar or similar as to what they are currently, without making it more difficult for certain segments of society to not have access. This is a key consideration in terms of how do we transform the portfolio and how do we implement the energy transition here in Hong Kong and other regions and markets where we operate as well.
So, given the overall position of the region in the rankings and those regulatory constraints that you talk about, how does Asia make progress in this area? Do the companies have to lead to a certain extent? Are they able to do that, or does it require a wholesale regulatory change from governments? And can that be done on an individual country basis, or does there need to be some kind of regional aspiration and cooperation?
Yeah, I mean, given that Asia Pacific is just so diverse in terms of the countries we have, the cultures we have, and the different sort of regulatory mechanisms in place, I think it would be a sort of a stretch at this point to imagine a regional cooperation that would enable much deeper or steeper decarbonization of the electricity sector. Having said that, I think the business angle and the push from corporates for demanding and continuing to demand low carbon or zero carbon electricity in order for, in particular, say the manufacturing sector, to help multinationals to decarbonize and to enable them to set net zero targets, for instance, I think is very important and needs to continue. But to me, that always begs the question, given, as was discussed earlier already, we are at the beginning of the supply chain, if you like, electricity being fundamental to just about anything that we do nowadays. And as is clearly reflected in the scoring and the ranking, there is inherent constraints in decarbonizing. It is dependent on location, on markets, on natural resource availability, whether that is wind, solar, or other technologies. And that in itself then being sort of a roadblock for companies that have manufacturing here in the region, and then going out saying we're going to be net zero by 2025 based on our scope 2. Okay, it's great, I love it. But at this point, it's really not entirely clear at all. And again, just looking at the rankings, how this could actually unfold.
Great, thank you, Hendrik, for that. Some really interesting divergence of perspectives from Europe and Asia there. I'd just like to thank Rasmus and Hendrik for their insights, and to congratulate them both for their sort of their top rankings, overall and regionally. We're going to move on now to look at understanding influence and speaking to policy. We're going to hear in a minute from Bruce Douglas, Director of Business Development and Communication at Euroelectric, but first from David Marshall, the Deputy Head of Expertise and Executive Programs at ADEME. So David.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this invitation. I work in ADEME. ADEME is the French agency for the ecological transition. One word about electricity in the energy mix. The electricity is, in the same time, one of the most important CO2 source due to fossil power plant, and also one of the strongest opportunity to decarbonize massively the economy. This is one of the most important source of CO2. As it was said today in Europe, the energy production sector, and in particular the electricity production, accounts for 27% of European greenhouse gases emission. But electricity is also one of the strongest opportunity to decarbonize massively the economy. The EIA scenario shows that electricity could increase by more than 75% by 2050. So to comply with Paris Agreement objectives, we have both to increase electricity production in the world and decarbonate. So in developing countries, where electricity consumption increase will be really significant, the major challenge is to build new electric systems, mostly powered by renewables. And in developed countries, it should be possible to develop new uses for electricity, for example, electric vehicles, heating and cooling, without increasing demand, thanks to energy efficiency. the major challenge will be to decommission most polluting power plants and replace them with renewables. These are technical challenges, but also social and economical challenges. The ADEME is a state body working for the ecological transition in France, and we have several missions. We deliver fundings to facilitate green projects. We build new tools such as ACT methodology, and those tools will support decision making. And we also carry out studies. And one of the major studies we published the last years deals with renewables development in the power mix in France. In this study, we use an optimization algorithm to minimize the cost of different pathways to 2050. The study concludes that the cheapest trajectories lead to more than 80% of renewables in the French power mix by 2050. And this conclusion takes every cost into account, all costs, storage, grids, production costs, and it also takes into account the natural resources. So for utilities, this study brings to light two other challenges. Reaching such shares of renewable will be easier if energy efficiency develops well. This is a new opportunity for utilities to help their clients refurbish their housings or optimize their industrial processes. Second challenge, reaching such share of renewable will also be easier if new flexibility appear. For this also, electric utilities have a key role to facilitate demand-side management. For instance, the potential of electric vehicle charging to absorb PV production during the day is tremendous, whereas letting electric vehicle charge on evening could cause electric peak demand side. This needs to be based on new business models, and those technologicals are far more competitive than carbon capture and storage, for instance. Some word about the ACT methodology now. As you may know, ACT is a joint voluntary initiative from ADEME and CDP. It's part of the UNFCCC Secretariat Global Climate Agenda. ACT methodology was used by World Benchmarking Alliance to realize this benchmark. This is the only international initiative that creates an accountability framework and sectoral methodologies to assess how company strategies and actions are contributing to the Paris Agreement mitigation goals. ACT performs a gap analysis. It determines the gap between the company's target and the company's current benchmark for a time horizon. And ACT assesses the effort level requested. ADEME and CDP are currently developing new methodologies, new sectorial methodologies. In 2016, some methodologies were developed, and electric utilities was developed at this moment, but also auto manufacturers, retail, building, and real estate. Other methodologies are under development right now: oil and gas, transport, and cement. And other methodologies are planned for 2020: iron, steel, agri-food, and another generic methodology. There is also a new methodology called ACT Step by Step, which is under development. And ACT Step by Step will provide a tool to define and implement an action plan to start a low carbon transition. To conclude, for utilities, for electricity utilities, ACT methodology, which was used for this benchmark, is a good tool for two main reasons. First, it takes into account production carbon content and investments of utilities all over the world. But it also includes the assessment of measures to empower clients or client engagement. As I said earlier, demand-side management and energy management are key to reach low carbon and renewable mix. So this benchmark using ACT methodology is, I think really useful, and I hope it will make companies gather momentum to reach Paris Agreement objectives. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, for that. We're going to move on to Bruce Douglas now, the Director for Business Development and Communication at Eurelectric, to get your perspective on the influence of policy and advocacy on the low carbon transition. Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Thanks a lot for the invite today. So Eurelectric is the European lobby organization based in Brussels. And through our national association members, we represent over 2,500 companies in the European power sector. So this benchmark is very welcome to us as an indication of the state of play in the world's power sector, but also a motivation for the coming years. It highlights the important role the power sector has to play in decarbonisation agenda generally, but also in the energy transition in particular. We also agree with the comment that electric sector is the great enabler, and I'll come back to that a bit later. We of course note, but are not surprised, that the benchmark highlights the leadership position of European utilities across many areas. And we're delighted to see our members are leading the charge to decarbonise, innovate and transition, like 9 out of the top 10 European utilities. Great to see Rasmus, and congratulations to Ørsted for your work. So I'll highlight 5 key areas over the next few minutes. Decarbonisation being the number 1. I mean, we as an organisation at Eurelectric have an agreed vision to be carbon neutral well before 2050. And so it's no surprise that our members are pushing this agenda both through their strategies and actions. The second is renewable energy. European utilities are the largest investors and operators of renewable energy assets, and the majority of investments in the power generation were in renewable energy over the last couple of years. The offshore wind sector, as Rasmus highlighted, is a good example of where European utilities are taking a leadership position. And generally across all renewables, the low cost of the technologies now mean that they are cost competitive with new build fossil fuel plants in most geographies. This is already having a dramatic effect on investment decisions. As Rasmus said, the business case for renewables is now clear, and that will drive change very rapidly. The third is innovation, and specifically on technology. The European utilities are leading on digitalization, renewables, as I say, charging infrastructure and storage, just some examples, and also on business models. So PPAs for the corporate procurement of renewable energy, and car charging, just two examples of innovative business models. Fourth is the carbon price. I mean, we support the emission trading scheme and its market-based approach to polluter pays. Also the investment signals that it can bring. We recognize that the talk in Brussels is often about a meaningful price, but we are now seeing that a higher and more stable carbon price can trigger fuel switching. And finally, onto policy, I suppose the topic of my speech, but very briefly, I mean, I completely agree with what Vicky said, and Hendrik backed up, which is that policy is critical. I mean, policy leadership is as important, if not more so, than company leadership. I mean, companies lead in the absence of political leadership. We need, as companies, we need long-term investor certainty, and companies are quite often faster acting than countries. Ambitious targets can help, but there's many policy areas where countries can play a role and provide that leadership. It'd be interesting for the World Benchmark Alliance to do a benchmark of governments. I don't know if that's yet been done, but I mean, we do that obviously in Europe. The national energy climate plans are a good indicator of where governments want to go. And I can tell you, it's a mixed bag of positive and negative. So we need governments to take the lead as well as utilities. Having said all that, I mean, we recognize the comments that you've made about increased ambition. We're not sitting still. In fact, we're doing everything we can to develop strategies, business models, legislation to align with the Paris Agreement. We look forward to working with the World Benchmark Alliance, your partners, EDEM, CDP, ACT, and others over the coming months and years to make that happen. Thanks very much. Maybe some questions.
Bruce, thank you. Thank you for these very clear remarks and also to reiterate European leadership and your role in that. One of the things that we've not touched base upon, but of course cannot be left unspoken, is what was the impact or is the impact of COVID-19 on the European power sector, or maybe even more broadly?
Yeah, it's a relevant question, Vicky. And I mean, just avoiding the negative impacts of COVID generally in terms of the health aspects. I mean, if I focus on the power sector, in fact, there's been some very positive aspects coming out of it. I mean, firstly, the resilience of the power sector. There's been no blackout so far in the last few months under what was extreme conditions in terms of power prices and staff availability. So that's a very good thing to take forward. And secondly, the shift in the power mix, shift from coal to renewables. With the power demand falling away, we saw coal dropping off the system. The UK had no coal in the energy mix in the electricity mix for the first time for 2 months or more. And that's the first time that's happened since the start of the Industrial Revolution some 150 years ago. That's set to continue. And coal was down something like 25% year on year, and that was following last year where it was down 16% year on year. So it's it's really falling off a cliff, which is good news. Really, I mean, can that continue? We'll see. We really need to build back better, as they say. And because of that, renewables were something like over 40% of the EU power mix. And then the question is, what's next? And again, policy is critical. The recovery plan that's being brought out now by the European Commission and the member states is critical, and it has to be a green-based recovery plan. I won't go into details, but you can imagine what that contains. A lot of the things I mentioned before.
Yeah, indeed. Last week, we also heard from Antonio Guterres saying there's no good reason that any country should include coal in their COVID recovery plans. That there should be the time to invest in energy sources that don't pollute and they generate new decent jobs and they have to save money. So I think that's very much tied into your story there. And then maybe last question is, could you elaborate a little bit looking ahead then what should be the main focus for the European power sector in the coming years? Because the study showed that there is more work to be done, more ambitious work to be done. So can you say, okay, what is then the immediate action that you think that the coming years should be taken?
Yeah, I mean, next steps are critical. We look forward to working with you. In fact, I'd welcome that, to work together. Now we've just did this this benchmark. I mean, if I pick one item, I mean, it's probably not the main focus, but certainly incredibly important for us is the shift to electrification of other sectors. And so I'm talking about obviously transport, e-mobility, heating, and industrial processes. Electrification can bring increased efficiency. I mean, electric vehicles and heat pumps are several times more efficient than their fossil fuel alternatives. We've established the Electrification Alliance here in Brussels, which has members from the wind, solar, EV, heat pump associations, amongst others. And we're pushing for positive legislation. Again, policy is really the key to it, to making the change. And on Wednesday, the Commission are coming out with a proposal for energy system integration. Today, the Parliament is voting on the Just Transition Fund. There's the renovation wave going on, which all can impact strongly the electrification in Europe. And one last word, I mean, the European utilities has the leadership, but it's also, I'd say, an opportunity for developing countries to leapfrog what we've been through, leapfrog to a system which is electrified, renewable, digital, smart. Yeah, thanks again, Vicky, and really appreciate the work you've done.
Yeah, thank you very much, Bruce, and also David. Thank you so much for your commentary and remarks. And back over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Vicky. And so we'll move on to the final section of the of this event. We'd like to take a look now at system transformation, and we're going to talk to Will Dawson, the Director of Climate and Energy at Forum for the Future, B Team's Emily Hickson, who is a strategist for climate and who galvanizes business leadership on climate in support of a just transition to a net zero economy, and Emily Krebs, the Global Director of CDP's Capital Markets Programme. So we'll start with Will, and perhaps you could say a few words on how the benchmark can be used to help people better understand, shape and drive the transformation of our energy system.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you very much for this opportunity. I think this is a really important contribution to the energy transition that the World Benchmarking Alliance has produced today. And so just for those who don't know, Forum is an international non-profit, and we work with business, government and civil society to solve complex sustainability challenges. And we focus in on 3 of those in food systems, value chains and livelihoods, and my area of limiting warming to below 1.5 degrees. It's been great to hear that being the target talked about by colleagues today. I think that climate change is one of a complex set of interwoven challenges with inequality, poverty, malnutrition, ecological degradation, to name a few. And what the benchmark does is really clearly shine a light through the power sector, and that as a system at a global level, in terms of where the biggest problems are, the companies which have done most to align with the Paris goals and those which are furthest behind, and the sort of scale of the problem. And I think what it does also is raise alarm that the scale of the problem is really quite substantial, and we've heard about Surprise today that that it's shown, and it's great to have those kind of shocking moments, because that's what creates action. And I think the way we would look at it is that we need perhaps new questions and new answers to those questions, and this is helping to raise those up. And those answers might get to some of the deeper root problems and some of the deeper root solutions to those problems in this system. We've heard that renewables are now cheaper than coal and gas for around 2/3 of the world's population. So then one question would be, why on earth then are we so off track from getting to that renewables future? And it seems like from that future picture as well, that the research has shown that doing this again in a few years, the situation is going to be even worse. So how on earth are we on that trajectory when the economics should be alone, regardless of climate action requirements, shifting us in that renewables directory? Perhaps part of the answer, comes from that long-standing power to the powerful dynamic in systems, where the fossil fuels has been the major player in energy for such a long time. They've built up the resources to continue that, the kind of lock-in through cheap access to capital, lobbying, corruption, power. But also, if you look at kind of the mindset shift required to go through such a deep transformation in technology, one of the questions you might ask out of this data is, why aren't minds changing fast enough? And it's great to see the work on narratives as part of that research, because that's a really important layer of the system, which is often underlooked. So that's one thing it can definitely do to help. And I think, though, what we also see is what is it about the alternative that might be slowing down the uptake of renewables beyond its economics? And so if you look at why isn't it appealing enough, there's probably two sides to that. One is that to look beyond this at the research by others in terms of Business and Human Rights Resource Centre, which shows that there's probably too much cause for concern about the practices of parts of the renewables industry. Its rapid growth is, of course, cutting carbon, but it's also having effects in terms of land degradation, biodiversity, waste from production and disposal in its value chains, in terms of human rights for land rights, indigenous people, and of course workers' rights as well. So coupled with that, you've also got fears from communities whose livelihoods are embedded with fossil fuel value chains. You know, what if coal mines close down or power stations are closed? So it's great to have this data. I think it opens up a great conversation, which can go on to that as well. And what we might see is with that concern of the actual transition itself, which this is calling for, the appetite from those who need to back that transition, to invest in it, to subsidize it, to free up land is inevitably weakened. Forum has a major presence in Asia, and we've launched a new initiative to kind of look at this in much more detail called the Net Positive Renewable Energy Initiative, bringing together renewables companies, investors, corporate power buyers, civil society and policymakers. We're kicking off an inquiry into India and plan to go to 2 other Asian countries, which, working with the World Resources Institute and the Energy and Resource Institute in India, we want to basically out of that to set a new set of norms across the Asia Pacific region and ultimately the world, that creates an industry that's contributing positively to the climate, the environment, the economy and local communities. We really need renewables to be as attractive as it possibly can for everyone who needs to back it and be part of that, so that as the powers come together to create the divestment out of fossil fuels in these power companies, that they've got confidence to also be able to go into the renewables with full vigor. And I think also that the other part I'd touch on is that the role of communities working with business is a really important area as well. And I think you'll probably find the companies who are top of this leadership table are the ones working closely with communities as they go through the transitions they're going through. And so we're really interested in how power companies can create the stories with local communities, even as they divest from power stations, to enable that community to kind of reimagine its future long before closures are announced. And so we've launched in the UK a project called the Local Just Transition Challenge to experiment with ways of doing that and look at that from a global perspective as well. So on both those projects, of course, you can contact me or look on the website for more details. And I think COVID's been mentioned. My last point, I guess, would be that, of course, you do this kind of research and then massive events happen like COVID, and that these massive events are enormous movements for change and will inevitably lead to change. And they're already impacting the power sector, as we've seen and just heard from Bruce and others. And we set out at Forum 3 trajectories of how the world can respond to COVID. The ones we kind of don't want to see is one which goes back towards the collapse scenario. We are inevitably on a kind of global collapse scenario before COVID, and the data shows that the power system, although it's kind of seen as the most decarbonizing in some parts of the world, was pushing us still on that trajectory. And it's the question really there is, how can we shift onto a transform scenario, one where the big powers from central government and banks, which are releasing stimulus packages, as we've heard as well in Europe, but into Asia, into Americas and Africa as well, are doing that in ways which really power the economy to if they are going to bail out fossil fuel industries in coal and gas, that they're doing that with the right strings attached, and mostly doing it to really accelerate renewables. And that goes back to that systemic picture. Of course, to accelerate renewables, they need to feel really positive about doing that and confident that it's not going to cause a backlash and overly harm to land ecosystems and communities they do that through. So I guess my message is that it's a complex picture, and it needs new questions and new answers to those questions, which this data really helps to shine a light through. My call would be to look at that light, but not look at just that bit of the system, to look at how this all interlinks together.
Great, thank you, Will. You mentioned, and others have mentioned it as well, the idea that we have a real opportunity. Sorry, excuse me. With the pandemic to build back better. How do you think that something like the benchmark, sorry, excuse me, frog in my throat, something like the benchmark can feed into that momentum that we have and help us to create something good out of this global disaster that we're all currently living through?
Yeah, it's a deep question. I think looking at those, I think the really great thing about the benchmark, I think for me, is that kind of current snapshot, and if we carry on like this, what the current future would be like. So it paints a scenario as well, and for me, that is down that collapse scenario where this is getting worse, and we're pushing further and further towards the climate thresholds down this route. It also shows which companies are, top of the list that need to transform and where they are. So which governments most need to make this kind of shift. I mean, the challenge is always with this is the speed at which we now have to act. And then nobody knew this pandemic was coming this year. And so, how can you get the Chinese government to not reinforce its backing for coal as it seems to be doing? How can you get the Indonesian government, etc., to do that? And the power of value chains and companies within the value chains for these power businesses, whether they're direct purchasers in terms of manufacturers in China or Asia, or they're buyers of those power. That's one way it can be done. And just putting pressure on to investors as well. I think it just really clearly shows where that pressure is needed.
Great, thanks very much for that. I will move on now to Emily Hickson, and perhaps take the focus sort of slightly more granular. Could you give us some thoughts on how benchmarks can contribute to shifting the culture of accountability within businesses to include not just the financial numbers and performance, but also we just heard about the importance of looking at people and planet. So how do you get them into a business's sort of strategic thinking to help drive the transition to low carbon that we need?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. And thank you for inviting me to this and for an exciting morning spent with the benchmark results. That was great to go through that ranking. So yes, I'm Emily Hickson. I work for an organisation called the B Team, which is a group of CEOs who have a collective mission to drive an inclusive economy. And I think I'll dig into what that means. So I'm not an energy expert per se, but I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about energy transition through the lens of just transition and some of those more social, people and planet factors that you just said about, Mike. So I'm going to make three main points. The first one just around why these benchmarks are so important and the stories that it tells us. The second point around how I think from a morning spent with this tells us, especially through the lens of system transformation, this tells us that we've got a lot to change in our politics as well as our policies. And the third point I want to make is about people and just transition, and why people are so important to this and behind a lot of the factors in the benchmark. So the first point I want to make is about the stories I think this benchmark tells us. So I, as well as representing the B Team, represent a coalition of organisations called We Mean Business, which CDP, the next speaker, also represents. And we, for years, since before the Paris Agreement, have worked very hard to tell the story of business ambition. So business commitment to tackling climate change. So thousands of businesses are set up to the types of commitments that we put forward, like RE100. So a lot of companies on the demand side saying that they commit to 100% renewable energy, and also science-based targets. And we have been very successful, I think, in being able to tell this story of ambition. And that is a true and credible story. However, what this benchmark obviously reveals to us is that ambition is only a small part. In fact, I think it's about 16% of the, if I could work out properly, about the kind of the indicators that you look at in terms of looking at targets and their alignments, and actually you find only 4 or 5 of SSE are committed to the 1.5 Paris aligned trajectory. So we're obviously still got a long way to go on the ambition front. And also the benchmark revealed that only in 2018, only 12% of capacity generated by these 50 companies was actually in renewables at all. So it definitely takes us a step further and trying to explain some of those discrepancies. And I think the most interesting part of the benchmark is actually around the narrative, because that's where it gets into the credibility of some of the business model transformations that we're seeing, the credibility of the management and of the plans out there, some of the risks involved in stranded assets and lack of coal phase out. So I think, as the stories go, it's telling us really to think, as well as about the kind of performance issues, it's also really pointing us towards the governance issues, about the credibility and risk issues, and about policy, as previous speakers have said before. And if we look, and I said I only spent a morning with it, so my analysis is probably not the full picture, but we do of course see a whole geographical discrepancy, and we also see a real discrepancy between state-owned enterprises and private enterprises. And I think we need to unpack some of that a bit more. So there's obviously a big policy issue, and some speakers before talked about enabling policies such as carbon prices. But and to move into my second point, I think the key thing that is coming out for me is that it's not just about policy, it's about politics. And what I mean by that is that we have seen policy play a big role. And in some of the good news stories in this benchmark, I think, are because enabling policy has come in, especially in Europe, around subsidies, driving down the price of renewable energy generation. And now, again, the previous speaker referred to the European Green Deal and the recovery packages. We are seeing some of those green shoots. But overall, we can see the picture is just not enough. And frankly, coal and oil don't burn themselves. There's a political settlement that allows this part of our energy mix to still retain, and will still retain for the next decades. So why isn't the politics moving fast enough? We know that lots of countries have got net zero commitments. I think around 67 have credible net zero commitments. So we are seeing that target set by countries, and yet again, like the previous speaker said, I'd like to see a benchmark where countries are really ranked on these clinical metrics, because I don't think that we'd find they are facing that the picture is any prettier on that side either, even if we are seeing some enabling policy come in. And then as I referred to before, I want what the benchmark is showing is this big regional discrepancy. And I think we need to get into that. And why are some of the factors that this is telling us why we're not seeing faster transition? Well, I think there are very real dependency issues between countries and the fossil fuel industry, energy industry at large. And they're important issues, and some of the factors that Will came into. There's huge amounts of tax revenue represented by these industries. There's dependency in terms of jobs, and I do want to come into that point a bit more. Huge contributions to GDP, and there's also political patronage, there's vested interests all through. And therefore, the politics of this transition is going to be incredibly important, and that's at state level. And also, of course, what we know, some of us who have followed the UNFCCC for years, at international level. And we've got to find this political settlement in order to drive a faster transition. And my third point, before I close, I don't want to speak too long, but behind that politics is people. I would really argue strongly that it's people. People need to understand that this transition is going to create better lives for them, their children, the next generation. And until we can convince people at large that this transition is going to be a net good, the transition won't happen as fast as we want it to. So why are we making this transition in the first place? It's because we want to provide a safe climate which people can thrive in, and the utility industry can't do that alone, which is why it goes back to the politics. But there are some things that that utility industry can do, and I think, you know, what's behind some of the factors in this benchmark. And I know that the World Benchmarking Alliance is actually going to do a separate study on just transition. So I think we will see these things come through more strongly. So I'd argue that a key part of transition readiness is actually, this is the social side, being able to see where companies are working with other companies, working with local government, working with trade unions, in order to invest in the local infrastructure, the education, the reskilling, the redeployment needed to enable a transition, to enable the politics to allow for people to know that their lives are going to get better through this transition and to have that transition. So a key part of transition readiness is not just investment in new renewable energy technologies, but actually investment in the enabling factors on the ground that allow people to understand the transition is something to be supported. So that investment in schools, investing in housing, education, is a long-term investment, but incredibly important to being able to see the trajectory and acceleration in transition. And that comes to, you know, and I think it's no surprise the study that Will just referenced by the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre and Renewable Energy and Human Rights, the companies that do best in that benchmark are largely doing best in this benchmark. So the settlement is really important. And the B team, we've worked with 4 companies that are in this study: Orsted, Enel, NG, Iberdrola, on a just transition pledge, which signs them up to clear labour criteria where they operate globally. And again, they're doing better in this study. We know that these things are linked, and I can dig more into that. So my call to action really coming from this benchmark, and to add to some of the other calls to action, because everything is important, it's a complex system, but is for companies to continue to support enabling policy, yes, but the enabling political factors. And that, you know, is not one thing in itself, but it is about maintaining being a responsible corporate citizen, paying fair tax everywhere you operate in order to allow the enabling conditions for a just transition to happen everywhere you operate. You know, playing a role in the kind of multilateral international politics frameworks, you know, really supporting the transfers you need of climate finance to developing countries in order for them to invest in a just transition. And also a key thing, I think, around, and I'm really glad it was in this benchmark, around negative lobbying, ensuring that there is no misalignment between your stated climate stances and the stances of your trade associations, because time and time again, failure in climate policy comes back to lobbying, corporate lobbying against it negatively, and it's a real problem. So I'll stop there and hand back over.
Thanks very much, Emily. There's loads in there that I'd love to unpick, but we're running a bit short of time, so I'm going to move on to the other Emily, Emily Krebs from CDP's Capital Markets team. And I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about the role of investors and the finance sector in driving decarbonisation in electric utilities, and because it seems to me that this is an area where there has been real progress in the last few years through groups such as Climate Action 100 and a number of others, and you know, a lot of pressure put on companies that seems to have led to substantive change, but at the same time we've got a long way to go.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you to our partners at WBA for having us today. Just a quick recap. CDP, we are a global nonprofit. We run the largest environmental disclosure platform in order to capture corporate activity that's aligned with the TCFD framework, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. We've got a 20-year track record on driving disclosure and transparency from corporates at the behest of investors, and increasingly we're seeing the broader capital markets ask for that information. So if you think about the CDP as a reporting mechanism for company reported data, many of the companies that are assessed by this benchmark report into that, and the first thing I would want to say is thank you to the companies, because we understand that it is it's no small undertaking to go through just that reporting process that CDP requests through our questionnaire. As the global director of our capital markets work, my focus is working with investors and other capital markets participants to look at this disclosure we've collected, understand the financial impacts. And increasingly, investors are looking at the data to understand, how do they think about this from a forward-looking perspective, both from a data perspective, but also from a strategy and operations perspective for the companies. So at CDP, we use the data collection process as a way to drive that forward-looking information. So for example, we collect targets information through the disclosure process, but we recognize that that is a company-led target. And so we are also a founding member of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which I know one of the previous speakers referenced as well. And we did that in order to drive harmonization of target setting to align on a sector-by-sector basis with a 1.5-degree world. So we have a long track record of assessment and scoring and such. And as a result, we're really pleased to work with ADEM on the shared goal of advancing carbon measurement to something that has that long-term orientation, that future-facing orientation. So how do we fit into this whole process? Because people have been very generous in including our names over the course of this conversation. But we work with the World Benchmarking Alliance to implement the climate and energy benchmark using sector-specific methodologies that we've developed via the ACT initiative, which is that joint initiative between CDP and ADEM. Now, why is it important to understand, all of those interworkings? Is, companies go through a very rigorous process of disclosing to CDP, and then, as I think, many are familiar, the ACT methodology then goes out and looks for additional information and says, how can we raise the ambition? What does the sector look like? And the reason for this, and the reason it's important to the capital markets, is companies have been driving this action. Emily Hickson talked about We Mean Business and the work that CDP does with the B team through We Mean Business to raise corporate ambition. But so we've been working with companies. Companies are at the top of this discussion. Policymakers are looking at this and saying, how do our policies support or distract from this? And we heard Euroelectric talk about, the importance of those policies, but also what's really important is, and I think it was the gentleman from Ørsted talking about the business imperative that needs to happen here, because no company is going to take an action that is fundamentally business negative to them. And one of the things that we've all talked about is how this transition, while it may be painful, is absolutely important. And it is an imperative, not just to have that 1.5-degree world, but to have a future-proof business model. And so that's really the position that I come from within the whole coalition of CDP, is working with investors and the capital markets participants to saying, your dollars, euros, pounds, yen, they will actually go to finance this transition, to push forward this transition. So are you putting your money in a place, in a company, in a process that is actually going to future-proof your investments or future-proof your business, and are you putting it with the right company? So, I think that's a really important point to remember from the capital markets perspective, is that there needs to be a business imperative. If hypothetically, we all have talked about the importance of being in a 1.5-degree world, let's take that portion out of it and say, we are asking companies to change the way that they work, to transition their business models. From a capital markets perspective, people want to see that done in an economically feasible and efficient way. It may be painful. And so I think we can't lose sight of that importance of what does the business imperative need to look like, and what the ACT methodology that the WBA is putting through in their energy and climate benchmark does, is really say, where is that gap? What is that transition? And again, the gentleman from Ørsted talked about the fact that it's a little frightening where the sector is versus where it needs to be. And that level of understanding is not as deep in the capital markets currently. So it's important for us to make sure that the capital markets are really pushing to understand this. And the best way we can do that, obviously, is through some of the advocacy work that we do. You know, it's fantastic when there are campaigns and initiatives and such, but unless it is evidence-based and data-driven, then we're not going to get to where we need to be by 2050 or even by 2030 at the rate we're going. So, you know, I could go off in a lot of different tangents about this, but the bottom line from CDP's perspective is we work very hard with our partners at ADEM on the ACT methodology, with our partners at WBA to implement this methodology for the climate and energy benchmark. And then it's my responsibility through CDP, but also through the coalitions that we're involved with, really to say, you know, here is the forward-looking evidence, here is how it is economically feasible, and here's why companies are doing it, and those companies that are at the leading edge are ones that have been actively thinking about how to finance this transition. And then the next step beyond that is saying, how do we finance the transition? You know, we're starting to see a number of the natural resource intensive economies turn to transition financing. So the same way that there is an EU taxonomy, which is very important, is how do we think about a transition taxonomy? And for the electric utilities industry, that is a really critical component. And I think that the ACT methodology implemented through this benchmark does a good job of starting to illuminate that. So just in terms of my sort of conclusions and my call to action, you know, my first conclusion is to the companies, thank you for disclosing. And this benchmark is simply, it's an assessment of where the world is. It isn't necessarily a reflection on companies that have done, you know, really, really well versus really, really poorly. There are companies that are at the forefront of that transition, like Ørsted, like CLP, and there are others who haven't woken up to it. So ideally, this is a way to wake up to that. But so to the companies, you know, my call is stick with it. Work with us. You know, we are focused on data-based and evidence-based. We're not out to destroy anyone's businesses. We're here to make them resilient. To the capital markets players, I would say dig in. If you're an investor, start looking for these forward-looking metrics. Look for comparable data on targets. Understand, you know, what do those targets mean, and how valid are they? Not just, you know, how reasonable are they for the company, but what's the methodology behind that? And anything that is less than open source should be questioned with a high degree of criticism. For the financiers in the capital markets, the banks, the brokers, the underwriters, you know, think about how you're allocating capital. To the credit rating agencies, think about driving the cost of capital. You know, transition financing should come with a preferential cost of capital. And then to those in the policy sphere, recognize that this is an iteration. You know, we in the NGO community, particularly at CDP, we look to certainly iterate around policy, but we also look to influence it in the way of saying, here's what we've found. You know, please construct accordingly. So I guess my call to action wouldn't be for any one area, but you know, the reality is this is not a criticism; it's an assessment. And it's important to understand that the more robust assessments we have, the better we're armed with information that's going to take us forward. So let me stop there. And Mike or Vicky, I don't know if there are any specific questions I should answer.
I think we can go over to Vicky for some closing remarks, and then I will sort of close things off.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I want to thank everyone, all the speakers, for participating. I think it was a very very lively, but also coming in from very different perspectives. So I want to thank you all for that. And I also want to reiterate that this benchmark is not the end. We need to see this benchmark as the start of engagement. Like what Emily says, this benchmark showed that it's evidence-based, it's comparing to the science that's out there. It uses a data-driven and it's open source. So we want to use this for further engagement. And we want to use this benchmark to really drive the corporate action. And we've heard that we need to the industry needs to step up on ambition, but we hope that this will inspire action across all stakeholder groups, and to make sure that we are securing a sustainable but also very much a just transition. We've obviously heard from leading companies, from Rasmus, from Ørsted, thank you for that, and Hendrik from CLP. And we hope, and we also invite other companies in the benchmark to further engage with us and with other initiatives to see what could be the next step in the ambition and setting further targets. But also we will be hosting further dialogues to bring different stakeholders together to really drive the next step in this transition. And as well, we heard from Eurelectric, Bruce, thank you, to say, okay, showing what the leadership is from the European region, but also to show how could this help other regions to leapfrog into the ambition, and not to make maybe small steps, but also to see how could we make sort of the next big step in delivering on these ambitions. Like what Adem reflected, David, thank you on your reflections on the regional trend and what the possibilities is from a political and policy perspective, and how we could engage with policymakers to really have targeted conversations with the use of the benchmarks and the data. Then, of course, lastly, I want to thank Will from Forum and Emily from the B team. Where I think what you really said very well, and I can't repeat it as well if you said it, so I won't even try, but for me was when you said working with all stakeholders and including communities to see how could we reimagine the future. And that includes for me politics, policy makers, it includes people, Emily, and it includes the way that the WBA works with including multi-stakeholder dialogues to really make sure that what we put out there is, yes, it's science-based, it's evidence-based, but it's also reflective of what society expects to see in this transition and see it happening. So, and of course, Emily from CDP, thank you. I think the investor voice is clear. It is clear that the business case is there. I also very much heard that it's risky for us to stay at the 2-degree scenario. We expect to see more ambitious pathways to be released by the IEA hopefully soon. So then we will look at 1.5 degrees and which we will use in our new iterations next year. But in the meantime, of course, we will engage with investors to make the business case and show that their business case is there when we discount for all the risks that are out there, all the risks of inactions, I would say. So yeah, I want to keep the summary with that, but I want to thank everyone on this call for participating. I want to invite everyone to, join up with us on future engagement moments, but also if you would like to reach out to us, please don't hesitate. It was great to see a lot of familiar faces through our alliance, our governments, donors and supporters. Thank you for that. And we take time to digest the results and the key findings, and also some questions and answers that might not have been answered now through the chat. We will gather this and we will make sure that we reflect on this later on. And please again consider this as a conversation starter, and we will welcome everyone in your continued feedback. So thank you for that, and back to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Vicky. And I just like to add my thanks to everyone for attending this event. Thank you to all our speakers and to everyone that asked questions. Vicky and the team will be in touch with follow-ups with regards to those questions in the coming days. So thank you all very much. That concludes this webinar.
Thank you, Mike, for your
Thanks.
post. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.